The shout cut through the corridor like a stone thrown into still water. "Nice limp, Grandpa." Paul Williams did not break stride. The cane in his right hand clicked softly against the polished floor, each step deliberate, steady, as though measured against something unseen. His left shoe scuffed lightly, the sound of a leg that had not walked without pain in 60 years. A couple of people chuckled from their seats along the wall. Most looked away, pretending not to hear. But the man who had spoken, tall, lean, his casual clothes rumpled like he had slept in them, rose from his chair, grinning. He fell into step beside Paul, bending slightly to match his pace, exaggerating each step into a crooked parody. "Pick it up," he barked, voice bouncing down the hallway. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, sharp under the steady drone of the hospital's intercom. Somewhere, a phone rang unanswered. At the far end of the corridor, a door opened. Commander Raymond Steele stepped out, his dress uniform immaculate, the ribbons on his chest catching the sterile light. His gaze fixed on the scene ahead, his posture tightening by degrees. Paul kept walking, his face calm, but his hand tightening on the cane's handle. He had heard worse, but the sound of Steele's boots striking the tile carried toward him, a slow, certain rhythm that hinted the moment was about to change. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The day began before the sun had fully risen, the sky outside still a muted gray. Paul Williams moved quietly through his kitchen, the floorboards beneath his feet carrying the faint groan of old wood. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the hiss of the gas flame blooming into a steady blue ring. The familiar scent of dry tea leaves met the rising warmth, a small comfort he had held onto for decades. In the corner, Max, his aging Labrador with a coat gone pale around the muzzle, watched from his bed, tail thumping softly. Paul poured a measure of kibble into the bowl, the sound drawing the dog up with a slow, dignified rise. He knelt to scratch Max's head, feeling the familiar weight lean into his palm. After his tea was poured, Paul stood by the small radio on the windowsill and turned the dial until the static gave way to the low murmur of the morning weather report. The voice spoke of a cool start, a hint of rain in the air. He took a sip, letting the warmth fill him, then set the cup down and reached for his jacket. Stepping outside, the morning air met him cool and damp. The street was still, save for the distant hum of traffic blocks away. Paul closed the door and began his short walk toward the corner, cane in hand, the tip clicking softly against the pavement. The quiet was broken by the sudden blur of a jogger passing too close, brushing his shoulder with a brief, impersonal rush of air. No apology, not even a glance back. Paul steadied himself, adjusting his grip on the cane, and continued. At the next block, a shallow pool of rainwater waited where the road dipped. A car approached, its tires slicing through the puddle without slowing. A spray of cold water splashed across Paul's shoes, soaking through the leather. The driver's silhouette didn't turn. The taillights faded into the distance. When he reached the corner, Mrs. Daly was standing on her porch across the street, a woman of his generation, silver hair pinned neatly, hands folded before her. Paul lifted a hand in greeting. She looked at him for a moment, her face unreadable, then turned and stepped inside without a word. The sound of the door closing seemed louder than it should have been. Back home, Paul polished his shoes despite the damp, smoothing the creases from his shirt. He selected his dark jacket from the wardrobe, brushed it with a quick, practiced hand, and set his cap squarely on his head. In the hallway mirror, his reflection stood straight, shoulders set, a small act of self-respect that would carry him through the day. When he locked the door and stepped out again, the air had changed, the first hint of rain sharp against the morning stillness. He made his way toward the bus stop, unaware that by afternoon, the weight of those small indignities would be overshadowed by a moment that would quiet an entire room. The bus ride to the VA hospital was quiet, the low rumble of the engine blending with the muted shuffle of passengers finding their seats. Paul sat near the front, his cane resting upright against his knee, his gaze fixed on the window. Outside, The city passed in a slow blur. Brick storefronts still shuttered from the night, streetlights clicking off one by one as the day took hold. When the bus stopped in front of the hospital, he stepped down carefully, the cool air meeting him again as his shoes touched the pavement. The VA building loomed ahead, all clean lines and glass, its flag rippling in the wind out front. He paused for a moment at the base of the steps, letting the familiar scent of cut grass from the landscaped grounds mix with the faint tang of rain in the air. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. The polished floors reflected the fluorescent lights above, the walls lined with framed photographs of men and women in uniform, some smiling in groups, others caught in the candid gravity of service. Paul moved at his steady pace, each tap of his cane echoing faintly down the corridor. The waiting area stretched along one wall of the main hallway, chairs half filled with patients and visitors. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the faint bitterness of brewing coffee from a small machine in the corner. Overhead, the hospital intercom called for a doctor, in a voice that had lost its urgency to repetition. Wheelchairs sat neatly in a row along the far wall, their chrome frames catching the light. A laminated poster from decades past hung crooked near the entrance, a young Marine in dress blues pointing toward the viewer under the faded words, "Serve with pride." The click of a receptionist's keyboard mixed with the rhythmic echo of a woman's heels as she crossed the lobby. The faint hum of an aging vending machine added a low undertone to the space, its lights flickering slightly. A young mother in a navy sweatshirt rocked a baby in her arms, the infant's small hand curling around the drawstring. Nearby, a man in a tan jacket flipped slowly through a folded newspaper, his eyes not really scanning the print. In the corner, an older couple sat side by side, their hands clasped loosely, their gazes resting on nothing in particular, the quiet companionship of years shared. It was then the first voice reached him, not loud, but carrying enough to catch the attention of those nearby. "Nice limp, Grandpa." The words were shaped in a tone that was more smirk than shout, a sneer woven into the edges. Paul didn't turn. He continued forward, eyes set on the reception desk ahead. A few heads lifted. Two young men sitting along the wall exchanged a quick glance, one suppressing a grin. Others looked down at their phones or shifted in their seats, as though distance could erase what they'd just heard. The voice came again, louder now. "Hey, pick it up!" The man stepped ahead, cutting across Paul's path, then circling back to fall in behind him. His steps exaggerated the limp even more this time, arms swinging wide in mock struggle. Passing Paul's left side, he leaned close enough that his words carried directly to his ear. "Bet you tell people you earned it the hard way, huh?" The smirk in his voice was as sharp as the grin on his face. Paul kept his eyes on the reception desk, his pace unchanged. But the man wasn't finished. He peeled away again, pacing a few strides ahead, only to slow and let Paul pass. Then matching him step for step once more, the mock limp dragging on for far too long. Paul's steps didn't change. The measured rhythm of cane and foot against the tile carried on. From the corner of his vision, movement. A tall, lean man in a faded hoodie stood from his chair and fell into step behind him, his gait a mocking imitation of Paul's. Exaggerated limp, head tilted, face curled into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. The low murmur of conversation in the hall thinned, replaced by the subtle pull of attention toward the unfolding moment. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened. A figure in dark navy stepped into view. Uniform crisp, cap brim low, the gold and silver of his insignia catching the light. Commander Raymond Steele's eyes found the scene, his pace slowing, his posture sharpening like a drawn blade. Paul reached the reception desk, placing his folded papers neatly on the counter. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, glanced up, then back to her computer screen. The sound of footsteps came from behind, the uneven, exaggerated mimicry of his limp. "What's the matter, old-timer? That leg too heavy for you?" The man's voice was louder now, inviting the corridor to listen. Paul's hand remained steady on the cane. "I'm here for my appointment," he said to the clerk, his voice low but firm. The clerk hesitated, eyes flicking between Paul and the man behind him. From a chair a few seats down, a nurse in light blue scrubs spoke up. "Sir, that's enough." Her tone carried a practiced edge, one born from calming unruly patience. The man turned toward her with a smirk. "Mind your own business, sweetheart." His voice was sharp, dismissive, designed to shut her out. The nurse pressed her lips together, shaking her head before returning to her clipboard. The clerk cleared her throat. "Sir, would you mind waiting just a moment? We have a few more urgent cases to process." She gestured toward the side, as if asking Paul to step away. Behind him, the mocking man chuckled. "Yeah, let the important people go first." Paul didn't move. He stood with quiet stillness, the kind that felt heavier than raised voices. The hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, the air tighter. A man seated near the wall shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as if to leave. Others avoided looking directly at Paul, their attention fixed on the floor or the glowing rectangles of their phones. At the far end of the hall, Commander Steele was still moving toward them, his pace steady, eyes locked on the scene. The metallic clatter of a crutch striking the tile rang out from somewhere down the hall. It was a small sound, but to Paul, it was not the present at all. It was the sharp, cold music of another lifetime. The polished tile beneath his feet became frozen ground, uneven and treacherous under combat boots. The chill in the hospital air deepened into the knife-edge wind of a Korean winter, slicing through the seams of his coat. The sharp scent of antiseptic was gone, replaced by smoke, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood. The cold on Hill 266 was the kind that seeped into bone and stayed there. Their rations froze solid in their packs, and men had to crack them open with the butts of their rifles just to eat. Frostbite was a constant warning, the medics reminding them to move their fingers and toes every hour to keep the blood flowing. Letters from home came damp, the ink smudged by snowmelt before it reached their hands. Thomas Albani sat beside Paul in the shallow shelter they dug, his breath clouding the air. "Got another one from home yesterday," he said, patting the breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded scrap. Not a letter this time, but a small photograph. The edges were creased and worn, the black and white image of a baby swaddled in a knitted blanket. "That's my boy," Thomas said, his voice soft but proud. "You know what my wife wrote? Said he smiled for the first time last week. Told me his whole face changed when he did it." Paul studied the photograph for a moment before handing it back. Thomas slid it carefully into his pocket, as though tucking the baby in for the night. The wind cut through them again, carrying with it the distant pop of small arms fire from somewhere along the ridge. Paul shifted his weight, feeling the sting in his leg from the last patrol. Around them, the squad huddled low, their breath fogging the air, eyes scanning the horizon. Then, without warning, the crack of a nearby round snapped them back into the urgency of the moment. His squad lay pinned under machine gun fire, the snow around them spitting up in bursts as rounds chewed into the ground. Beside him, Thomas Albani was crouched low, breath ragged, words breaking between clenched teeth. "Baby boy, born last month. Just want to see him." His eyes were wide, the urgency of his confession cutting through the chaos. Then Thomas broke from cover, scrambling across the open. Paul's gut tightened the moment his friend moved. The open ground between their trench and the next bit of cover was no more than 30 feet, but on Hill 266, that might as well have been a mile. The enemy's machine gun rattled, spitting dirt and snow into the air. He pushed himself up, the weight of his gear dragging at his shoulders, the canteens and ammo pouches clanking in rhythm with each step. His boots sank into snow so crusted with ice that it cracked underfoot, slowing him. A round hissed past his ear, the sound so close it pulled the air from his lungs. Another hit the ground ahead, throwing up a spray of frozen mud that stung his face. The cold bit through his gloves as he grabbed Thomas under the arms, feeling the limp heaviness of a man trying to stay conscious. The smell of blood, sharp, coppery, mixed with the acrid smoke from a shell that had gone off seconds earlier. Inch by inch, they moved. Paul's wounded leg protested with every step, pain flaring in white-hot bursts. His breath came ragged, the icy air burning his throat. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Artillery boomed again, the ground vibrating beneath them. The foxhole was close now, just a few more yards. Artillery thundered somewhere beyond the ridge, a deep rolling boom that shook the frozen ground. The air stung with cordite and cold. Paul dragged his friend inch by inch, bullets hissing close enough to part the air by his face. By the time they reached the edge of the foxhole, a searing blow tore through Paul's already wounded leg. His body buckled, but his grip on Thomas did not falter. He dropped into the hole, pulling Thomas in beside him, shielding him until the firing slackened. "You'll be all right," Paul said, his voice a promise and an order at once. Thomas survived. He would go home to hold his newborn son because Paul had refused to leave him behind. The stinging wind softened. The sound of gunfire thinned into the squeak of sneakers against polished tile. The weight of the snow melted back into the cane in Paul's hand. The VA hospital corridor returned, but the leg that had carried Thomas to safety still bore the same ache. The man behind him still stood smirking, unaware of the history he mocked. The smirk on the man's face faltered when a shadow stretched across the floor beside him. The sound of measured footsteps followed, each one striking the tile with the calm precision of someone accustomed to command. Commander Raymond Steele stopped just far enough to take in the whole scene. Paul at the counter, papers neatly placed. The young man behind him, posture loose but eyes alert for attention. The small, uneasy crowd watching without speaking. The overhead lights caught in the gold of Steele's insignia, throwing back a glint with each step. His shadow stretched ahead of him, long and straight, falling across the floor until it reached the mocker's shoes. His gaze locked on the man. Not a glare, but a fixed, unwavering look that carried more weight than raised voices ever could. He took in every detail of the corridor in a sweep. The clerk's stiff posture, the nurse's tightened grip on her clipboard, the subtle shifting of feet among the seated. "You're looking at Sergeant First Class Paul Williams," Steele said, his voice low but carrying. "Korean War and Vietnam veteran. 2 tours, commendations for valor, a leg shattered while saving another man's life on Hill 266. The hallway stilled. Even the faint hiss of the air vents seemed to recede. Steele's gaze never left the man who had been mocking. The soldier he saved went home to meet his newborn son, because this man refused to leave him behind. His words were precise, unhurried, each one landing like a hammer driving a nail. Steele let the silence linger a beat, then continued, his tone even but carrying to the furthest chair. "Sergeant First Class Paul Williams served in 2 wars. He earned the Bronze Star for valor under fire, the Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat, and the Army Commendation Medal with V for valor. Not once, but twice. His record includes citations from commanders who trusted him to lead when the stakes were life or death. General Howard himself wrote that Paul's courage under pressure embodied the highest traditions of the United States Army." The shift in the crowd was almost tangible. A man near the wall removed his ball cap, holding it to his chest. The older couple laced their fingers tighter. Someone in the back cleared their throat quietly, as though the weight in the air demanded it. A nurse straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting in a subtle mirror of Steele's stance. Paul stood as he had all along, steady, straight-backed, eyes forward. A nurse halfway down the corridor set aside her clipboard, her hand pausing on the chair beside her. A man in civilian clothes leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. The 2 young men who had smirked earlier now stared at the floor. Steele stepped closer to Paul, his presence not crowding but anchoring the space. This man walks with a limp because he carried another soldier through gunfire and artillery. That limp is a mark of honor, not shame. The words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. Commander Steele shifted his weight, squaring his shoulders. Then, without another word, he brought his hand up in a sharp, deliberate salute. The movement was crisp, precise, the kind that came from years of habit and the weight of understanding exactly what it meant. The hall froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air felt charged, the kind of stillness that happens before a flag unfurls in the wind. The nurse who had spoken up earlier was the first to follow. She straightened, her face set with quiet conviction, and raised her hand in the same gesture. Across the corridor, a man in a worn leather jacket stood, removed his cap, and placed it over his heart. The ripples spread. Chairs scraped softly against the tile. A patient in a wheelchair lifted a trembling hand to his brow. Two orderlies stopped mid-step, joining the growing line of salutes and bowed heads. Paul turned his head slightly, meeting Steele's eyes. For a moment, the sounds of the hospital, the intercom, the shuffle of papers, the distant rolling of a cart, seemed to fade into nothing. Slowly, he straightened as much as his leg would allow, lifted his own hand, and returned the salute. The room did not cheer. There were no claps or shouts, just the shared silence of people bearing witness, the weight of respect hanging in the air like a flag at full mast. The young man who had mocked him earlier stared at the floor, his jaw tight, his posture shrinking in on itself. Whatever words he might have had were gone. The moment lingered, even after Paul lowered his hand. People returned to their seats slowly, as though afraid that moving too quickly might break something fragile they had just shared. The nurse gave Paul a small nod, before picking up her clipboard again, her eyes softer now. The clerk at the reception desk cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice more careful than before, "let's get you checked in right away." She reached for his papers with both hands, as if they deserved more than a casual grab. Commander Steele remained by Paul's side, his presence alone keeping the space around them still. He glanced at the clerk. "Make sure he's seen without delay." It was not a request. The young man who had been mocking Paul stayed near the back of the corridor. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a restless shift of weight from one foot to the other. His eyes flicked once toward Paul, then down again. Within the hour, the ripples of the incident reached the hospital's administrative wing. A note went out from the director's office. Patient dignity is non-negotiable. By the end of the week, a framed copy of the Code of Respect hung in the main lobby, positioned so no one could miss it on their way in. For Paul, the rest of the appointment passed quietly. But as he stepped outside into the afternoon light, he could still feel the echo of the salute. Not just Steele's, but the dozens of silent acknowledgments that had followed. It settled over him like a well-worn coat, familiar and warm. The community hall was alive with the sounds of celebration. Chairs scraping against the floor, the hum of overlapping conversations, the occasional burst of laughter that rose above it all. Brightly colored streamers hung from the ceiling, swaying gently in the current of the air conditioning. Paul stepped inside, cane tapping softly, the faint scent of coffee and sheet cake greeting him. Along the walls, tables were crowded with plates, half-empty punch bowls, and photographs from the graduation ceremony earlier that day. Near the center of the room stood a tall young man in a black cap and gown, his tassel swaying as he turned to greet relatives. His smile was easy, but when he noticed Paul at the door, it shifted, deepened, into something warmer. He crossed the room with quick strides, removing his cap as he came closer. Extending his hand, he said, "Mr. Williams, I'm Michael. My grandfather was Thomas Albani. He told me what you did for him. On that hill." Paul took the young man's hand, the grip firm, respectful. For a moment, the noise of the room seemed to fall away. "He made it home," Paul said, his voice steady but softer now. "That's what matters." Michael's eyes held a kind of gratitude that didn't need more words. He nodded once as if acknowledging a debt that couldn't be repaid, then gestured toward the group gathering for a photo. Paul stepped back, watching as the Albani family assembled. Parents, children, grandchildren, all the threads of a life that might have been cut short had things gone differently decades ago. The camera's flash lit the room, freezing the moment. While Paul stood at the edge, the weight on his shoulders lightened just enough to feel it. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we will walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.